My own son told a judge I wasn't capable of taking care of myself anymore and tried to steal my house. The words still echo in my mind like a death sentence. How do you prepare for the moment when the child you raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for becomes your greatest enemy? Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Margaret Jennings, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. The morning it all began, I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd fed my family for 45 years. The wooden table, scarred from homework sessions and birthday cakes, held my morning coffee in the chipped blue mug David had made me in 3rd grade. His small fingerprints were still visible in the ceramic, a reminder of when his hands were innocent and his love was pure. The house around me breathed with memories. Every creaking floorboard told a story. The loose one by the bathroom that warned me when David tried to sneak out as a teenager. The squeaky step that announced Santa's arrival on Christmas mornings. The front door that had welcomed countless friends and family over the decades. This wasn't just a house. It was the museum of my life. I was wearing my favorite lavender cardigan, the one my late husband Robert had bought me for our last anniversary before the cancer took him. The sleeves had small holes now, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. It still smelled faintly of his cologne when I pressed my face into the collar. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. I watched them float, thinking about how they reminded me of all the moments that had filled this space. Birthday parties, homework struggles, quiet dinners, heated arguments, and tearful reconciliations. Each particle of dust held a memory, and I was the keeper of them all. That's when David arrived. I heard his car door slam with unusual force, and my stomach tightened with an inexplicable dread. Mothers develop an instinct about their children's moods, and something in that sound warned me that today would be different. His footsteps on the front porch were heavier than usual, deliberate and cold. When he walked into my kitchen, he wasn't my little boy anymore. At 45, David had grown into a man I barely recognized. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, the kind of confident stride that came from boardroom victories and suburban success. His eyes, once warm brown like melted chocolate, had turned calculating and distant. He carried a briefcase that looked more like a weapon than a work accessory. "Hi, Mom," he said. But there was no warmth in it. The word Mom sounded like a job title, not an endearment. "David, sweetheart." I stood up too quickly, my arthritic knees protesting, but I couldn't contain my excitement. It had been 3 months since his last visit, and I'd missed him desperately. "I was just thinking about making your favorite chocolate chip cookies. The ones you used to—" "I can't stay long," he interrupted, setting his briefcase on my table with a sharp click. "I brought some paperwork that needs your signature." Paperwork. Always paperwork with David now. When had our relationship become nothing but forms and signatures, and legal documents I didn't understand? He opened the briefcase with mechanical precision, revealing neat stacks of papers organized with colored tabs. Everything about him was organized now, efficient, sterile. I remembered when his backpack used to overflow with crumpled homework and soccer cleats that smelled like grass stains and childhood dreams. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, settling back into my chair. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller with his presence, as if his ambition and impatience were too large for the cozy space where I'd taught him to crack eggs and measure flour. "Just some financial protection stuff," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Power of attorney forms, property management agreements. Nothing complicated. Just sign where I've marked with the yellow sticky notes." His voice was too casual, too rehearsed. I'd heard this tone before, when he was 7 and tried to convince me he hadn't broken the neighbor's window. When he was 16 and swore he hadn't been drinking at Jenny Morrison's party. David had always been a terrible liar, but apparently, he'd had 45 years to practice. I picked up the first document, squinting at the small print that seemed to blur despite my reading glasses. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of words like incapacitation and mental decline and transfer of assets. My heart began to race as the implications slowly crystallized. David, I said carefully, what exactly does this mean? It says something about transferring ownership of the house to you for my protection and care. It's just a precaution, Mom. He was pacing now, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor I'd mopped thousands of times. You're getting older. What if something happens to you? What if you get confused and someone takes advantage? This way, I can make sure you're taken care of. Confused. The word hit me like a slap. I set the papers down with trembling hands, studying my son's face for any trace of the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who cried when his goldfish died, who hugged me so tight after his father's funeral that I thought my ribs might crack. I'm not confused, David, I said quietly. I balance my checkbook every month. I manage my medications. I drive to the grocery store and the doctor's appointments. I've been taking care of myself for 73 years. I know, he said, finally sitting down across from me. For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his features. It's just, the house is so big now, and it's old. Things are always breaking down. Wouldn't you be more comfortable somewhere smaller? Somewhere with people your own age? People my own age. Code for a nursing home. Code for getting me out of the way so he could sell the house and cash in on 45 years of my mortgage payments and Robert's life insurance money. I thought about the garden where I'd taught him to plant tomatoes, where his children, my grandchildren, should have been learning the same lessons. I thought about the bedroom where Robert and I had planned our future, where we'd whispered dreams and fears in the darkness. I thought about the living room where David had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated every Christmas morning, where I still sat every evening and remembered what it felt like to matter to someone. This is my home, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I'm not signing anything. The transformation in David's face was immediate and chilling. The practiced smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and determined. This was the face of a stranger, a businessman who'd just been told no by someone he considered insignificant. Mom, he said, and now the word sounded like a threat. You need to think about this rationally. I'm trying to help you here, but if you won't accept my help voluntarily, he left the sentence hanging like a noose. I stared at my son, this man who'd grown from my body, who'd nursed at my breast, who'd been the center of my universe for 45 years, and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd lost him. Or maybe he'd lost me. Maybe I'd become just another obstacle between him and whatever life he thought he deserved. Get out, I whispered. What? Get out of my house. My voice was stronger now, fueled by a rage I didn't know I still possessed. Take your papers and your briefcase and your threats and get out. He stood up slowly, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. You're making a mistake, Mom. A big mistake. The only mistake I made, I said, standing to face him, was raising a son who could look me in the eye and try to steal my home. David packed his papers with sharp, violent movements, snapping the briefcase closed like a trap. At the kitchen door, he paused and turned back to me. You'll regret this, he said. When you're old and alone and confused, and no one will help you, you'll remember this moment. After he left, I stood in my kitchen and listened to the silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet I'd grown accustomed to since Robert's death. This was the silence of abandonment, of being truly alone in the world for the first time in my life. I looked down at my hands that had changed countless diapers, prepared thousands of meals, worked 2 jobs to pay for David's college education, held my husband's hand as he died. These hands that had given so much, asked for so little, and were now shaking with the knowledge of my son's betrayal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs that chronicled a life of love and sacrifice. In David's old bedroom, I found his high school trophies still displayed on the dresser. Academic achievement awards, soccer medals, the scholarship certificate I'd framed with such pride. I'd been so proud of him, so proud of the man I thought he'd become. Now I wondered, was this my fault? Had I loved him too much? Given him too much? Made him believe that my love, my home, my entire existence were just resources for him to manage and ultimately claim? As dawn broke over the neighborhood where I'd lived for 45 years, I made myself a cup of coffee in the same chipped mug and sat at the same scarred table. But everything was different now, because I finally understood that the child I'd raised, the son I'd loved unconditionally, was prepared to destroy me to get what he wanted. And the most terrifying part was realizing that he probably thought he was doing me a favor. The days following David's visit blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I found myself doing something I'd never done before, questioning every choice I'd made as a mother. Was I wrong to trust him? Had I been blind to who he really was? I pulled out the old photo albums, their pages yellowed and crackling with age. Each picture told a story of sacrifice I'd forgotten, love I'd given freely, and dreams I'd abandoned for my son's future. Here was David at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the bicycle I'd bought by working double shifts at the diner for 3 months. I remembered eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could afford the bike he'd wanted so desperately. He'd ridden it exactly twice before deciding he wanted a skateboard instead. Here was his high school graduation photo. I could still feel the pride that had swelled in my chest that day, watching him walk across the stage in the cap and gown I'd layaway purchased over 6 months. What I couldn't see in the photo was the exhaustion in my eyes from working 3 jobs to keep him in private school, because he'd insisted the public school wasn't good enough for his college aspirations. There was the picture from his college acceptance party, $22,000 in student loans I'd co-signed, convinced that his education was an investment in our family's future. I'd refinanced the house twice to help with his expenses, while he complained that his dorm room was too small and his meal plan insufficient. Each photograph was a monument to my love, and looking at them now, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. David had learned early that my love had no limits, no conditions, no expiration date. He'd learned that no wasn't a word that applied to him where I was concerned. I remembered the conversation we'd had when he was 25 and wanted to buy his first house. "Mom, I need $15,000 for the down payment. It's a great investment. You'll get it back when the house appreciates." I'd liquidated my small retirement account without hesitation. Of course I would help my son achieve his dreams. That's what mothers do. He'd never paid me back. When I'd mentioned it a year later, he'd looked at me with genuine confusion. "I thought that was a gift, Mom." I mean, it's not like you need the money right now. Not like I need the money. As if my financial security was less important than his real estate portfolio. The phone calls over the years had followed a predictable pattern. David would start with small talk. "How are you feeling, Mom? How's the weather?" Before moving to the real purpose. "Listen, I hate to ask, but Emma needs braces. And with the mortgage and car payments, we're a little tight this month. Could you help us out? Just a loan, of course." Emma's braces, Tommy's summer camp, the family vacation to Disney World that became a family bonding experience I needed to fund. The new car when theirs broke down, because taking the bus wasn't an option for David's children. Every emergency somehow became my responsibility to solve. I'd written checks and emptied savings accounts and taken on debt because David always made it sound temporary, urgent, unavoidable. "I'll pay you back next month when the bonus comes through. This is the last time, I promise. You know I'm good for it, Mom." But the bonuses never materialized into repayment. The last times multiplied like cancer cells. And my trust, my love, my financial security slowly eroded while David's lifestyle improved year by year. I found the Christmas card I'd saved from 3 years ago, the last one they'd sent. David's wife Jennifer had written it, her handwriting precise and cold. "Hope you're well. The kids are growing so fast. David got promoted again. We're thinking about a house in the suburbs. No mention of the $5,000 I'd given them the month before when David called. Panicked, saying they might lose their apartment. No acknowledgement of the money that had probably helped fund their suburban dreams. I'd sent them a Christmas check that year, like every year before. $200 I couldn't really afford, tucked into a card with a handwritten note for the grandchildren. "Love always, Grandma." The check had been cashed within 3 days. I never received a thank you note. The pattern of phone calls had changed gradually over the years. Once, David called every Sunday, chatting for an hour about work and the kids and life. The conversations became shorter, more focused, more transactional. By the time Robert got sick, David's calls came monthly, then sporadically, always with a purpose that required something from me. When Robert was dying, I'd called David, sobbing, begging him to come home. "I can't do this alone," I'd whispered into the phone. "Your father is asking for you." "I'm really swamped at work right now, Mom," he'd said, his voice distracted. I could hear the clicking of computer keys in the background. "But I'll try to get up there next weekend." He'd arrived 2 days after the funeral, wearing an expensive suit and an expression of mild inconvenience. He'd stayed for 4 hours, spent most of that time on his phone with work, and left with Robert's golf clubs and his collection of vintage watches. "Dad would want me to have these," he'd said, packing them efficiently into boxes he'd brought from home. "And you don't need all this stuff cluttering up the house." Cluttering up the house. 45 years of marriage reduced to clutter. I'd given him the watches because I couldn't bear to argue while my grief was still raw. I'd rationalized that Robert would indeed want David to have them, that material possessions didn't matter when your heart was breaking. But late at night, alone in the bed I'd shared with my husband for 4 decades, I'd wondered if David had seen his father's death as an inheritance opportunity rather than a loss. The visits became even less frequent after Robert's funeral. David would show up every few months, usually with some financial crisis that required my intervention. The pool in their backyard needed repairs. Emma wanted to take violin lessons. Tommy had been accepted to a prestigious summer program that cost $3,000. Each request was presented as an opportunity for me to be a good grandmother, a supportive mother, a valued family member. Each payment I made was an investment in maintaining the connection to my son and grandchildren, the only family I had left. But I was starting to see the truth that I'd been too loving, too hopeful, too desperate to acknowledge. I wasn't family to David anymore. I was a resource, a bank with emotional vulnerabilities that made me easy to manipulate. The grandchildren stopped visiting when they turned 12 and 13. "They're so busy with school and activities," Jennifer would explain when I asked to see them. "You know how it is with teenagers." I didn't know how it was with teenagers. I'd missed watching them grow up, missed being part of their daily lives, missed creating the kinds of memories I'd treasured from David's childhood. They'd become strangers who existed only in the Christmas photos Jennifer occasionally texted me, always asking for money in the same message. I started to notice other things too. How David's voice changed when he talked about his friends, his colleagues, his neighbors. Warm, engaged, animated. When he talked to me, his tone was flat, efficient, polite. I was a task on his to-do list, an obligation to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. The house around me felt heavier with these realizations. Every room held evidence of the love I'd poured into raising David, the sacrifices I'd made to give him opportunities I'd never had, the kitchen where I'd packed his school lunches for 12 years, the living room where I'd helped him with homework every night, even when I was exhausted from my own work, the basement workshop where Robert had taught him to use tools, passing down skills and stories, and the belief that hard work and integrity mattered more than money or status. We'd raised David to be better than us, to have more opportunities, more choices, more security. We'd succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. He had the career, the house, the family, the lifestyle we'd only dreamed of providing for him. But somewhere in that success, he'd learned to see us, to see me, as inferior, as someone whose needs and feelings and dignity were less important than his convenience. Sitting alone in my kitchen, surrounded by 4 decades of memories and realizations I'd been too afraid to face, I finally asked myself the question that had been haunting me since David's visit. Was I used? The answer came immediately, clearly, devastatingly, yes. And the most heartbreaking part was realizing that I'd trained him to use me. I'd taught him that my love had no boundaries, that my resources existed for his benefit, that my happiness was optional as long as his needs were met. I'd created my own betrayer, one generous gift, one selfless sacrifice, one boundaryless act of love at a time. The phone rang, jarring me out of my painful reverie. For a moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was David calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo the damage of our last conversation. But when I answered, It was an automated voice reminding me about my doctor's appointment next week. The appointment I'd be going to alone, like I went everywhere alone now. When the call ended, the silence in my house felt different. Not peaceful, but hollow. Empty of the illusions that had sustained me for so many years. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my son clearly, and the truth was almost too painful to bear. 2 weeks passed after David's failed attempt to get me to sign those papers. 2 weeks of silence that felt like a punishment, a withdrawal of whatever minimal affection I'd been receiving. I'd always known David could be stubborn, but this felt different, calculated, deliberate. My 74th birthday arrived on a Tuesday in March. I woke up early, as I always did, and made my coffee in the same chipped mug. The house felt especially quiet that morning, wrapped in the kind of silence that makes you aware of every creaking board, every settling beam, every sound of a structure growing old alone. I'd been telling myself for weeks that David would call. Surely he wouldn't forget my birthday. Surely, despite our argument, he'd remember the day I'd brought him into this world. The woman who'd given him life and love and everything she had to give. I waited by the phone until noon, then until dinner, then until the 10 o'clock news ended and there was nothing left to wait for. The phone never rang. For 74 years, someone had acknowledged my birthday. My parents when I was young. Robert for 45 beautiful years. David for most of his life. But this year, March 15th came and went like any other day. Unmarked and uncelebrated. As if I'd become too insignificant to warrant even a 5-minute phone call. I made myself a small cake from a box mix. Vanilla with chocolate frosting, the same kind I'd made for David's birthdays when money was tight. I lit a single candle and sat alone in my kitchen, singing Happy Birthday to myself in a voice that cracked with unshed tears. The cake tasted like sawdust and grief. 3 days later, the phone finally rang. My heart jumped with pathetic hope until I heard David's voice. Cold and businesslike. Hi, Mom. I need you to sign some papers I'm having delivered tomorrow. Medical power of attorney forms. It's just a precaution. In case you get sick and need someone to make decisions for you. No happy birthday. No apology for the silence. No acknowledgement that he'd forgotten the most important day of my year. I don't want to sign anything, I said quietly. Mom, be reasonable. You're not getting any younger. What if you have a stroke? What if you fall and hit your head? Who's going to make medical decisions for you? His concern felt hollow, rehearsed. I could picture him in his office, probably checking email while he talked to me, treating this conversation like another item on his professional to-do list. I'll manage my own medical decisions, thank you. You can't manage everything yourself forever. His voice had an edge now, impatience bleeding through the fake concern. You need to start accepting help before it's too late. What I need, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice, is a son who remembers my birthday. There was a pause, a long telling pause that confirmed what I already knew in my heart. I've been busy, he said finally. Work is crazy right now. Too busy to make a 5-minute phone call to his mother. Too busy to remember the woman who'd never been too busy for him. Not once in 45 years. I have to go, I whispered, and hung up the phone. After that, the pattern of neglect became more pronounced, more deliberate. It was as if David had decided that since I wouldn't cooperate with his plans, I no longer deserved even the minimal courtesies he'd been extending. The Easter card I sent to his family went unacknowledged. The Mother's Day bouquet I'd hoped for never arrived. When I called his house and asked to speak with my grandchildren, Jennifer would always have an excuse. They're at friends' houses, or they're doing homework, or they're just so busy with school activities. I began to understand that I was being erased from their lives systematically, methodically. My grandchildren were being taught that Grandma was someone they could forget, someone whose feelings didn't matter, someone who existed on the periphery of their lives rather than at the heart of their family. The loneliness became a physical ache in my chest, a constant companion that followed me from room to room. I'd always been comfortable with solitude, but this was different. This was isolation imposed by the very people who should have been my anchor in the world. I started talking to Robert's photograph more frequently, carrying on conversations with the framed picture on my nightstand as if he could somehow bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between the love I'd known and the abandonment I was experiencing. "What did I do wrong?" I asked his smiling face one evening. "How did I raise a son who could just forget me?" But Robert's photograph offered no answers. Only the memory of a man who'd loved me unconditionally, who'd valued my opinions and cherished my presence, and never made me feel like a burden or an inconvenience. The 4th of July came and went without an invitation to David's annual barbecue. For 8 years running, his family had hosted a big celebration with friends and neighbors and elaborate decorations. I'd always been included, always had a lawn chair reserved for me, always felt like part of the festivities. This year, I watched the fireworks alone from my back porch, listening to the laughter and music drifting from his neighborhood 6 miles away. I imagined my grandchildren running around with sparklers, eating watermelon and hot dogs, creating memories that would last their lifetimes, memories that wouldn't include me. The exclusion felt intentional, punitive. I was being punished for refusing to sign his papers, for asserting my independence, for failing to be the compliant, grateful old woman he apparently thought I should be. In August, I got sick with a respiratory infection that left me weak and breathless. For 3 days, I couldn't get out of bed except to use the bathroom and take my medications. I called David's office, explained to his secretary that I was ill and needed help, asked if he could stop by or send Jennifer to check on me. He never came, never called back, never sent anyone. I recovered alone, sustained by crackers and ginger ale and the realization that if I'd had a heart attack, if I'd fallen down the stairs, if I'd died in my sleep, David might not have discovered my body for weeks. That terrifying thought led to an even more devastating realization. He might not have cared. By September, the transformation in our relationship was complete. The son who'd once called me every week now communicated only through lawyers and legal documents. The boy who'd hugged me goodbye at every visit now treated me like a stranger who happened to share his last name. I found myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for clues about what had changed in me to warrant such indifference. My hair was grayer, yes, and my face more lined. My hands were more gnarled with arthritis, my movements slower and more careful. But my mind was sharp, my spirit unbroken, my love for my family unchanged. So why had I become invisible to the most important person in my world? The answer came to me gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I'd been too afraid to examine clearly. It wasn't that I had changed. It was that my usefulness to David had expired. For years, I'd been valuable to him as a source of financial support, emotional labor, and unconditional approval. I'd been the mother who said yes to every request, who never criticized his choices, who made his problems disappear with checks and sacrifices and boundless love. But now, with Robert gone and my resources limited, with my own needs becoming more apparent, and my willingness to be exploited finally reaching its limits, I'd become a liability instead of an asset. I was no longer useful. I was just inconvenient. The phone calls from David's lawyer started in October. Formal, intimidating letters about capacity evaluations and elder care consultations arrived in my mailbox with frightening regularity. Each document was filled with legal language designed to make me feel incompetent, vulnerable, in need of protection that only David could provide. I understood now that my refusal to sign his papers hadn't ended his plans. It had simply forced him to pursue more aggressive tactics. Late one night, unable to sleep, I walked through my house and touched everything Robert and I had built together. The kitchen table where we'd planned our budget every month, careful and deliberate with every dollar. The living room where we'd watched our son grow up, where we'd celebrated his achievements and comforted him through disappointments. The bedroom where we'd whispered our hopes and fears and promises in the darkness. This house held the entire story of my adult life. Every room contained evidence of love given and received, of a family that had once been whole and happy and real. David wanted to take it away from me. He wanted to erase the final chapter of my story, to write the ending himself in a language of legal documents and court orders and what's best for Mom. But as I stood in the home I'd fought to keep for 45 years, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times and the echoes of love that had once felt eternal, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to let him win without a fight. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something besides grief and confusion and betrayal. I felt angry. And maybe, just maybe, anger was exactly what I needed to survive what was coming next. The anger that had awakened in me felt foreign at first, like wearing someone else's clothes. For 74 years, I'd been the peacemaker, the accommodator, the woman who swallowed her pride and her pain to keep everyone else comfortable. But David's systematic campaign to erase my independence had finally pushed me past my breaking point. I started with small acts of defiance that felt enormous to someone who'd spent a lifetime saying yes. When his lawyer called requesting a meeting to discuss care options, I said no. When the social worker David had somehow recruited showed up unannounced to conduct a wellness check, I politely but firmly declined to let her in. "Mrs. Jennings," she'd said through my screen door, consulting a clipboard with practiced efficiency, "your son is concerned about your ability to maintain this large house safely. I'm here to help assess your needs and discuss available resources." "My son," I'd replied, standing straighter than I had in months, "hasn't been in this house for 6 weeks. He has no idea what I can or cannot maintain safely. I don't need assessment, and I don't need resources. I need to be left alone." The social worker had looked surprised, as if elderly women weren't supposed to have opinions about their own lives. She'd made notes on her clipboard, probably marking me down as uncooperative or resistant to help, and left with promises to follow up that sounded more like threats. But my small victory felt hollow because I knew David was just getting started. Within days, the retaliation began with surgical precision. First, he called my bank. Somehow, using his name and claiming concern for my welfare, he managed to get information about my accounts. When I went to make my usual monthly withdrawal, the teller looked at me with uncomfortable sympathy. "Mrs. Jennings, your son contacted us about monitoring your account for unusual activity. He's requested that we flag any large withdrawals or suspicious transactions." My own son had essentially put surveillance on my money, treating me like a criminal who couldn't be trusted with my own finances. Every purchase I made would now be scrutinized, every financial decision questioned. Then came the calls to my neighbors. Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned it while we were both checking our mail. "Your David called me yesterday," she said. Her weathered face creased with confusion. "Asked if I'd noticed you acting strangely lately, forgetting things, wandering around confused. I told him you seemed sharp as ever to me, but he kept pressing with specific questions." My blood turned to ice. David was systematically building a case against me, recruiting my own community as witnesses to my supposed decline. He was turning my neighbors into spies, my daily life into evidence for his court case. The pharmacy calls came next. My longtime pharmacist, Mr. Chen, looked uncomfortable when I came in for my prescriptions. "Mrs. Jennings, I have to ask, are you having any trouble remembering your medications? Your son called asking about missed pickups, confusion about dosages, any signs of cognitive issues. I'd never missed a pickup, never confused a dosage. My medication routine was as precise as clockwork, organized in weekly pill containers that I filled every Sunday while listening to classical music on the radio. There are no issues with my medications," I said firmly. "And I'd prefer that my son not receive information about my prescriptions without my written consent." But the damage was done. David had planted seeds of doubt everywhere I went, created a narrative of mental decline that would follow me through my daily routines. Even Mr. Chen, who'd known me for 15 years, now looked at me with the careful attention reserved for people who might be losing their faculties. The cruelest blow came in the form of my grandchildren. David had weaponized even them against me. Tommy, my youngest grandson, called me on a Sunday afternoon. The first time I'd heard from him in months. My heart swelled with joy until I heard the rehearsed quality of his voice. "Hi, Grandma. Dad asked me to call and check on you. Are you eating okay? Are you remembering to take your pills? Do you need help with anything around the house?" He was 15 years old, and David had turned him into an investigator. My own grandson was calling not out of love, but because his father had assigned him to gather intelligence about my capabilities. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep the heartbreak out of my voice. "How are you? How's school?" "Oh, it's good. Listen, Grandma, Dad says you might come live with us soon. Wouldn't that be nice? You wouldn't have to worry about taking care of that big house anymore. The script was so obvious, so carefully crafted. David was using my grandchildren to normalize the idea of me losing my home, making it sound like a gift rather than a theft. "This is my home, Tommy," I said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him consulting notes or getting coaching from someone off the phone. "But Dad says the house is too much work for you, and you get confused sometimes." Confused. There was that word again, the weapon David was using to destroy my credibility everywhere I went. "Tommy, has your father told you that I get confused?" "Well, yeah. He says you forget things and make bad decisions sometimes. He's just worried about you." My 15-year-old grandson had been trained to see me as incompetent, unreliable, in need of management rather than respect. David wasn't just stealing my house. He was stealing my relationship with my grandchildren, poisoning their perception of me with lies that would be impossible to disprove. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and felt the full weight of David's strategy. He wasn't just attacking me legally, he was destroying me socially, professionally, personally. He was systematically dismantling every support system I had, every relationship that might advocate for me, every voice that might contradict his narrative of my decline. The mail brought more evidence of his campaign. Letters from estate planning attorneys I'd never contacted, offering free consultations about protecting my assets, brochures for assisted living facilities that looked expensive and sterile, information about home health services that emphasized peace of mind for worried family members. David had put me on mailing lists, signed me up for services, created a paper trail that suggested I was actively seeking help for problems I didn't have. But the most devastating discovery came when I tried to call my oldest friend, Ruth, who lived in Arizona. We'd been friends for 50 years, maintaining our relationship through letters and weekly phone calls even after she'd moved away. "Margaret," she said when she heard my voice, "I was just thinking about you. David called me last week. He's so worried about you, honey. He says you're having memory problems and struggling to take care of yourself. Even Ruth. Even my dearest friend, who lived 2,000 miles away and had no way to verify David's claims, had been recruited into his campaign." "Ruth, I'm fine," I said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice now. The careful tone people use when they think they're talking to someone who might not be entirely rational. "Of course you are, dear. But maybe it wouldn't hurt to have a little extra help. David says he's found some lovely places where you could have your own apartment, but with support when you need it." That night, I walked through my house and saw it with new eyes. Not as the home I'd built and maintained for 45 years, but as David saw it. As an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be solved, evidence of my incompetence that needed to be managed. Every creaking floorboard would be interpreted as a safety hazard. Every dust bunny under the furniture would be evidence of my inability to maintain proper hygiene. Every forgotten grocery item would be proof of memory loss. Every independent decision I made would be scrutinized as potential evidence of poor judgment. David had turned my life into a court case where I was both the defendant and the evidence. And he was building toward something bigger, something final. I could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, devastating, designed to sweep away everything I'd spent a lifetime building. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't going to face it passively. If David wanted a fight, if he was determined to destroy me to get what he wanted, then he was going to discover something he'd apparently forgotten in his 45 years of taking my love for granted. His mother didn't raise a victim. She raised a fighter. And this fighter wasn't finished yet. The turning point came on a gray December morning when I received a certified letter that required my signature. The mail carrier, Mrs. Rodriguez, had known me for years, and I could see the sympathy in her eyes as she handed me the thick envelope. "Court documents," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jennings." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, though whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. Inside were papers that made my worst fears official. David had filed a petition for guardianship, claiming I was mentally incapacitated and unable to make decisions about my own welfare. The legal language was dense and cruel, full of terms like diminished capacity, unsafe living conditions, and financial vulnerability. David's lawyer had crafted a narrative that painted me as a confused, declining old woman who posed a danger to herself and needed the protection that only a loving son could provide. The hearing was scheduled for January 15th, 3 weeks to prepare for a battle I'd never wanted to fight, armed with nothing but the truth and my own determination to survive. I sat at my kitchen table and read those papers 5 times, each reading making the reality more devastating and more clear. David wasn't just trying to take my house, he was trying to take my entire life. If he succeeded in getting guardianship, I would lose the right to make any decisions about where I lived, how I spent my money, what medical care I received, who I could see. I would become a legal child, with David as my parent, able to override any choice I made about my own existence. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I called a lawyer. The consultation with attorney Sarah Martinez cost me $300 I could barely afford, but it was the first money I'd spent on myself, rather than David, in longer than I could remember. Ms. Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of my younger self. "Mrs. Jennings," she said after reviewing David's petition, "this is serious. Your son is alleging that you're incompetent to manage your affairs. Do you have any documented cognitive issues? Any medical evidence that might support his claims?" "None," I said firmly. "I've had the same doctor for 20 years. I manage my own medications, my own finances, my own household. I drive, I cook, I maintain my property. There's nothing wrong with my mind." "Then we need to prove that," she said. "I'm going to recommend a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by an independent psychologist. We need documented evidence of your mental competency. Can you afford the evaluation?" It would cost $800. $800 that would drain my small savings account. But what choice did I have? I was fighting for my freedom, my dignity, my right to exist as an autonomous human being. "I'll find the money," I said. Dr. Elizabeth Harper conducted the cognitive evaluation in her office downtown. For 3 hours, she put me through tests that measured my memory, reasoning, problem-solving abilities, and mental agility. I answered questions about current events, solved puzzles, recalled lists of words, performed calculations, and demonstrated that my 74-year-old mind was as sharp as it had ever been. "Mrs. Jennings," Dr. Harper said at the end of our session, "your cognitive function is excellent. You scored in the top percentile for women your age in every category we tested. There is absolutely no evidence of mental decline or incapacity." The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the devastating realization that I'd been forced to prove my own sanity, because my son had publicly declared me incompetent. But I wasn't finished fighting. If David wanted to play this game with lawyers and court documents, I was going to show him that I'd learned a few things in my 74 years about strategy and determination. I spent the next week documenting everything. Every bill I'd paid on time for the past 5 years. Every medication I'd managed correctly. Every appointment I'd kept. Every responsibility I'd fulfilled. Every decision I'd made that demonstrated my competence and independence. I gathered statements from my doctor, my pharmacist, my neighbors who weren't contaminated by David's propaganda campaign. I collected bank records showing prudent financial management, utility bills showing consistent payments, maintenance records proving I kept my property in good condition. Most importantly, I started keeping a journal of every interaction with David, every attempt at manipulation, every lie he'd told about my condition. If he wanted to paint me as confused and unreliable, I was going to present a very different picture in court. But the hardest decision came next. I realized that fighting David meant accepting that our relationship, whatever was left of it, would be permanently destroyed. There would be no going back from this kind of betrayal. No possibility of reconciliation after he'd tried to have me declared incompetent in a court of law. I was choosing my freedom over my family, my dignity over my desperate hope that somehow, someday, David would remember how to love me again. The choice should have been easy, but it broke my heart anyway. On Christmas Eve, I did something that felt revolutionary. I put up decorations for myself. Not for family who wouldn't visit, not for grandchildren who'd been taught to see me as incompetent, but for Margaret Jennings, who deserved to celebrate surviving the worst year of her life. I hung lights on my small Christmas tree and played carols on the radio and cooked myself a proper Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. I set the table with my good china, the wedding set I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come, and I ate my meal slowly, savoring every bite. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. Not happiness, that would come later if it came at all, but a deep sense of rightness about the path I'd chosen. I was fighting for myself. At 74 years old, I was finally learning to put my own needs first, to value my own dignity above my son's convenience, to choose my own freedom over his financial planning. The phone rang during dinner. For a moment, my heart leaped with the ridiculous hope that it might be David calling to wish me Merry Christmas, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage of the past year. But it was a recorded message from a debt collection agency, probably triggered by one of David's many attempts to access my financial information. Even on Christmas Eve, even during the one peaceful moment I'd managed to create for myself, his campaign of destruction followed me. I deleted the message and returned to my dinner. The ham was perfectly cooked, the vegetables seasoned just right, the pie I'd made from scratch exactly as good as I remembered from years of family celebrations when Christmas actually meant something. After dinner, I sat in my living room and looked at the photographs that lined my mantelpiece. 45 years of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family vacations, and milestone celebrations. A lifetime of love and memory and shared joy that David was apparently willing to destroy for the sake of real estate equity and perceived convenience. But as I studied those pictures, I began to see them differently. Yes, they represented love that had been lost, family bonds that had been severed, relationships that had been poisoned by greed and manipulation. But they also represented strength. They showed a woman who'd raised a family, maintained a household, built a life of meaning and purpose through decades of challenges and changes. They proved that Margaret Jennings had always been more resilient, more capable, more valuable than anyone, including herself, had ever fully recognized. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because my problems were solved, but because I'd finally stopped running from them. I was going to fight David in court, with lawyers and documentation and evidence of my competency. But more importantly, I was going to fight for something I'd lost track of somewhere in 45 years of selfless motherhood, my own worth. For the first time since this nightmare began, I woke up the next morning feeling something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. I felt proud of myself. The old Margaret would have signed David's papers months ago, would have sacrificed her independence to avoid conflict, would have chosen peace over justice and compliance over dignity. But the woman who was emerging from this crisis, the woman who'd hired a lawyer and documented her competence and decorated her own Christmas tree, she was someone new, someone stronger, someone who'd finally learned that survival sometimes requires you to disappoint the people you love most, especially when they've stopped loving you back. The court hearing was still 3 weeks away, and I knew David wasn't finished with his attempts to destroy me. But for the first time since this battle began, I wasn't afraid of what he might do next, because I'd finally remembered something that 45 years of motherhood had taught me to forget. I was worth fighting for. January 15th arrived gray and bitter cold, the kind of winter morning that makes your bones ache and your breath visible in small clouds of determination. I dressed carefully that day. My best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. If David was going to try to strip away my dignity in public, I was going to face him looking like the competent, self-possessed woman I'd always been. The courthouse felt like a mausoleum, all marble floors and high ceilings that made every footstep echo with the weight of judgment. My lawyer, Sarah Martinez, met me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her expression professionally calm, but her eyes filled with the kind of compassion that comes from understanding exactly what this moment meant. "Are you ready, Mrs. Jennings?" she asked, adjusting her briefcase with the precise movements of someone who'd fought these battles before. "As ready as anyone can be to prove they deserve to control their own life," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Inside the courtroom, David sat behind a mahogany table with his lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. David wouldn't look at me, wouldn't meet my eyes, as if acknowledging my presence might somehow humanize the woman he was trying to legally erase. He looked successful, confident, like a man who'd never doubted that this hearing was just a formality before getting what he'd always expected to inherit. His wife Jennifer sat behind him in the gallery, checking her phone with the bored expression of someone attending a routine business meeting rather than the destruction of her husband's mother. Judge Patricia Coleman called the court to order with the authoritative tone of someone who'd presided over too many family disasters to find any of them particularly shocking. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to cut through pretense with surgical precision. "We're here today," Judge Coleman announced, "to consider a petition for guardianship filed by David Jennings regarding his mother, Margaret Jennings, age 74. Mr. Jennings claims that his mother is no longer capable of managing her personal affairs and requires court-appointed supervision for her own protection." David's lawyer stood and began his presentation with the practiced smoothness of someone who specialized in dismantling elderly people's independence for profit. "Your Honor, Mrs. Jennings is living alone in a large house that she can no longer maintain safely. She's become increasingly isolated, resistant to help, and shows signs of cognitive decline that put her at risk. Her son, Mr. Jennings, is deeply concerned about her welfare and seeks only to ensure that she receives the care and protection she needs." He presented his evidence like a prosecutor building a case. Photographs of my house that emphasized every minor flaw: a loose shutter, leaves in the gutters, a small oil stain on the driveway. Reports from neighbors who'd been coached to express concern about my memory and judgment. Financial records that painted my modest lifestyle as evidence of inability to manage money properly. "Mrs. Jennings has become increasingly paranoid and uncooperative," the lawyer continued. "She refuses assistance, rejects reasonable suggestions about her living situation, and displays the kind of impaired judgment that often accompanies age-related cognitive decline." As I listened to this stranger describe me as a confused, paranoid old woman who needed to be saved from herself, I felt something inside me crystallize into pure, clean anger. Not the chaotic rage of betrayal I'd felt for months, but the focused fury of someone who'd finally had enough. When Sarah Martinez stood to present my defense, her voice rang with the authority of someone who believed completely in her client's competence. "Your Honor, Mrs. Jennings is a sharp, capable woman who's being victimized by a son who apparently values real estate more than he values his mother's dignity. She's passed comprehensive cognitive testing with flying colors, manages her household and finances independently, and has never given anyone reason to question her competency except for refusing to sign documents that would have given her son control over her assets." She presented Dr. Harper's cognitive evaluation, my financial records showing years of responsible money management, statements from medical professionals confirming my mental and physical health, and testimony from neighbors who hadn't been contaminated by David's propaganda campaign. "Mrs. Jennings doesn't need protection from her own decisions," Sarah concluded. "She needs protection from a son who's using the legal system to override her autonomy because she won't voluntarily give him what he wants." When Judge Coleman asked if I wanted to speak on my own behalf, I stood on legs that felt steadier than they had in months. My voice, when it came, was clear and strong. "Your Honor, I've lived independently for 74 years. I raised a family, maintained a household, worked full-time jobs, and cared for my dying husband without anyone questioning my competence. I manage my medications, pay my bills, drive safely, and make informed decisions about my life every single day." I looked directly at David for the first time since entering the courtroom, and he finally met my eyes. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been shame flicker across his features. "My son claims he's concerned about my welfare, but he hasn't visited my home in months. He doesn't know what I eat for breakfast, whether I sleep well, or how I spend my days. He can't name my doctor, my medications, or my closest friends. His concern is based on financial projections, not love." The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. "I don't need someone to make decisions for me because I disagree with my son about what those decisions should be. I need the right to live my remaining years with the dignity and independence I've earned through 7 decades of responsible choices. As I sat down, Judge Coleman was already reaching for her gavel when the courtroom door opened with a sharp creak that made everyone turn. Jacob walked in. My grandson, tall, earnest, 22 years old, holding something in his hand that looked like a small recording device. David's face went pale, then red, as Jacob approached the judge's bench with the determined stride of someone who'd made a difficult decision and intended to see it through. "Your Honor," Jacob said, his voice clear despite the obvious nervousness, "I'm Jacob Jennings, Mrs. Jennings's grandson and Mr. Jennings's son. I know I wasn't called to testify, but I have evidence that's relevant to this case." David's lawyer immediately objected, but Judge Coleman held up her hand for silence. "What kind of evidence, young man?" Jacob held up the recording device. "Recordings of my father discussing his real motivations for this guardianship petition. Conversations where he admits this isn't about my grandmother's welfare. It's about controlling her assets and selling her house." The courtroom erupted. David was on his feet, his lawyer frantically shuffling papers, Jennifer looking stricken for the first time all day. But Judge Coleman's gavel brought immediate order. "I'll allow it," she said. "Play your recordings, Mr. Jennings." Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he connected the device to the courtroom's audio system, but his voice was steady when he addressed the court. "Your Honor, these are conversations I recorded over the past 6 months when I realized what my father was planning. I started recording because I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I thought someday someone might need proof of what he really said when he thought no one was listening." The first recording filled the courtroom with devastating clarity. David's voice, discussing his mother problem with Jennifer in their kitchen. "Once we get her declared incompetent, we can sell that house and finally have enough capital to buy the lake property we've been wanting. She doesn't even use half the rooms anymore, and the property value has tripled since Dad died. It's ridiculous for one old woman to be sitting on that much equity." Jennifer's voice responded, "But what if she fights it? She won't. She's old, she's alone, and she doesn't understand legal processes. Besides, who's going to believe her over us? We'll present it as loving children concerned about their declining mother. The courts eat that stuff up." A second recording played, this one from a conversation with David's business partner. The lawyer says it's a slam dunk. "We document a few minor household maintenance issues, get some neighbors to say they're concerned, and boom. Guardianship granted. Mom gets moved to a nice facility where she'll be safe, and we liquidate the real estate before she can spend it all on medical bills and cats." The courtroom was stone silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Hearing David's voice, cold and calculating, describing me like a business obstacle to be removed, was somehow worse than all the months of legal documents and manipulation. But Jacob wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there's one more recording I need you to hear. This was my father talking to me directly, trying to get me to support his plan." David's voice filled the courtroom one final time. "Jacob, you need to understand. Your grandmother is becoming a burden. She's selfish for holding on to that house when she could be in a facility where professionals can take care of her. We're her family, which means we have the right to make decisions about what's best for her, especially when she's too stubborn to see reason." When the audio ended, Judge Coleman leaned forward and fixed David with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Jennings, do you deny that those are your words?" David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence stretched for a full minute before Judge Coleman continued. "Not only am I denying your petition for guardianship, I'm ordering an investigation into potential elder abuse and financial exploitation. Your mother is clearly competent to manage her own affairs, and your motivations for this action are demonstrably fraudulent." She turned to Jacob with something approaching a smile. "Young man, your grandmother is fortunate to have someone willing to speak the truth on her behalf. If Mrs. Jennings agrees, I'm prepared to recognize you as her designated advocate for any future legal matters." Jacob walked over to me and took my hand, the first gentle touch I'd received from a family member in almost a year. "I'm sorry it took me so long, Grandma," he whispered. "I should have spoken up months ago." Judge Coleman's gavel came down with the finality of justice delivered. Case dismissed. As we walked out of that courtroom together, Jacob supporting my arm not because I needed it, but because he wanted to. I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. I felt protected, valued, loved by someone who saw me as a person worth defending rather than a problem to be solved. David had lost more than a legal case that day. He'd lost his moral authority, his credibility, and any claim to the love and respect of the one person in the family who'd been watching and judging his character all along. Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes salvation comes from the next generation, from young people who still remember what integrity looks like and aren't afraid to choose it over family loyalty. Jacob had given me back my freedom, my dignity, and my faith that love, real love, still existed in my family, even if it came from the most unexpected source of all. The weeks following the court hearing felt like waking up from a long, suffocating nightmare. For months, I'd been living under the weight of David's manipulation and threats, constantly defending my right to exist as a competent human being. Now suddenly, the pressure was gone, lifted by a judge's gavel and my grandson's courage. But freedom, I discovered, was more complicated than I'd expected. The first morning, I woke up knowing that my house was truly mine again, that no one could force me from my home or declare me incompetent. I sat in my kitchen and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of someone who'd been holding her breath for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe normally. Jacob had stayed overnight that first night after the hearing, sleeping in his father's old bedroom for the first time in years. I'd made him breakfast, real breakfast with eggs and bacon and fresh orange juice, and we'd sat at my kitchen table talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding a relationship that David's manipulation had nearly destroyed. "Grandma," he'd said, looking uncomfortable but determined, "I need to tell you something. Dad has been saying things about you to the family for months, making us think you were getting confused, that you needed help you wouldn't accept. I believed him for a while because I wanted to believe he was being a good son." His honesty was both painful and healing. "What made you change your mind?" I started paying attention to the things he said when he thought no one was listening. The way he talked about selling your house, about dealing with the mom situation. He wasn't talking like someone who loved you. He was talking like someone who saw you as a problem to solve. Jacob had risked his relationship with his father to save me. At 22, he'd shown more integrity and courage than David had displayed in his entire adult life. The transformation in my daily routine was gradual but profound. For the first time in almost a year, I wasn't spending my days gathering evidence of my competence, documenting my activities, or preparing defenses against attacks on my mental state. I was simply living. I started with small changes that felt revolutionary after months of survival mode. I bought myself fresh flowers for the kitchen table, bright yellow daffodils that announced spring was coming despite the February cold. I painted my fingernails a bold shade of coral that I'd admired but never dared to try. I ordered books from the library, mysteries and romances I'd been too distracted to enjoy during the legal battle. Most importantly, I started making plans that extended beyond survival. For the first time in months, I was thinking about my future again, imagining possibilities instead of just trying to endure the present. In March, I did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center. The instructor, a gentle woman named Helen who was about my age, welcomed me with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than patronizing. "Have you painted before, Margaret?" "Not since high school art class," I admitted. I always wanted to try again, but there was always something more important to do. That first afternoon, mixing colors on a palette and watching them bloom across wet paper, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The pleasure of creating something beautiful just because I wanted to, with no purpose except my own satisfaction. The other women in the class became unexpected sources of friendship. There was Ruth, a retired teacher who painted delicate botanical studies. Carmen, a former nurse who specialized in bold, abstract landscapes. Dorothy, a widow like me who'd started painting after her husband's death, as a way to rediscover who she was beyond wife and mother. "I spent 50 years taking care of everyone else," Dorothy told me as we cleaned our brushes one afternoon. "When Harold died, I realized I'd forgotten how to take care of myself, how to want things just for me." These women understood something that David never could. that rebuilding a life after loss wasn't about being taken care of. It was about remembering how to care for yourself. The Sunday dinners with Jacob became the anchor of my week, but now they were celebrations rather than the desperate attempt to maintain family connection they'd once been. He brought his girlfriend Sarah sometimes, a smart young woman who treated me with genuine warmth and asked thoughtful questions about my life. "Jacob talks about you all the time," Sarah told me one evening as we cleaned dishes together. "He says you're the strongest person he knows." Strongest person he knows. When had anyone seen me as strong rather than fragile? Capable rather than vulnerable? "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "I feel like I'm learning how to be myself again." "That sounds pretty strong to me," she said with a smile. The most dramatic change was in how I moved through the world. The constant anxiety that had plagued me for months, the hypervigilance of someone under siege, gradually faded. I stopped checking my locks obsessively, stopped jumping when the phone rang, stopped analyzing every conversation for hidden threats. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, to make decisions without second-guessing myself or imagining how David might criticize my choices. In April, I took the biggest step of all. I planned a trip to Europe. It was something Robert and I had always talked about doing, someday, when we had enough money, when David was older, when work wasn't so demanding. Someday had never come for us, but it had finally arrived for me. Jacob helped me research tours and book flights, his excitement almost matching my own nervous anticipation. "Grandma, this is amazing. You're going to love London and Paris. Dad always said you were too old to travel internationally." Too old to travel. Another limitation David had imposed on my life without my even realizing it. Another way he'd convinced me to make myself smaller to fit his expectations of what elderly women should and shouldn't do. "I'm 74, I said firmly. "That's not too old for anything I want to do." The night before my departure, I stood in my house and saw it with completely new eyes. Not as the prison David had tried to trap me in, but as the foundation that had given me the stability to rediscover my independence. Every room held memories of love and loss, struggle and triumph, but also evidence of a woman who'd survived every challenge life had thrown at her. This house wasn't just shelter. It was proof of my resilience, my capability, my right to make my own choices about how and where I wanted to live. Jacob arrived early to drive me to the airport, carrying my suitcase with the same protective care he'd shown since the court hearing. As we loaded my luggage, I caught sight of myself in his car's side mirror. The woman looking back at me had graying hair, yes, and lines around her eyes, but she also had something that had been missing for too long, a spark of anticipation, of joy, of someone who was excited about her own life. "You look beautiful, Grandma," Jacob said, following my gaze. "You look alive." Alive. That was exactly right. For months, I'd been merely surviving, enduring, defending my right to exist. But now I was living again, making choices, pursuing interests, creating experiences that belonged entirely to me. At the airport, Jacob hugged me goodbye with fierce affection. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered in my ear, "for fighting back, for not giving up, for showing me what courage looks like." As my plane lifted off from Chicago, carrying me toward adventures I'd dreamed about for 50 years, I pressed my face to the window and watched my familiar world grow smaller below me. I was 74 years old, and I was just beginning to understand who Margaret Jennings could be when she stopped trying to be everything to everyone else and started being enough for herself. The transformation wasn't complete. I suspected it would take years to fully reclaim all the pieces of myself that I'd given away over the decades. But I'd taken the first, crucial step. I'd remembered that my life belonged to me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was excited to see what I'd do with it. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen on a September morning, sunlight streaming through windows that I cleaned myself last week, drinking coffee from the same chipped mug that has witnessed every chapter of this story. But everything is different now, not because my circumstances have changed dramatically, but because I have. The Europe trip was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more. I stood before the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, walked across London Bridge at sunset, ate croissants in sidewalk cafes while watching the world go by. But the real revelation wasn't in the famous sights or exotic experiences. It was in discovering that I could navigate foreign countries, manage travel logistics, and make new friends entirely on my own. I wasn't the confused, fragile old woman David had tried to convince everyone I was. I was an adventurous, capable, interesting person who'd simply been buried under decades of other people's expectations. The photos from that trip sit on my mantelpiece now, not just as memories of beautiful places, but as proof of what becomes possible when you stop letting other people define your limitations. David and I haven't spoken since the court hearing. I've heard through Jacob that he and Jennifer are having marriage problems. Apparently, she wasn't impressed by his willingness to destroy his own mother for financial gain. Sometimes I feel a twinge of sadness for the family that might have been, but I've learned to distinguish between grief for what was lost and regret for what was necessary. I don't miss David. I miss the son I thought I had, the man I hoped he would become. But I don't miss the anxiety, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I was failing to meet expectations I'd never agreed to accept. Some battles are worth winning, even when victory comes at the cost of relationships you thought you couldn't live without. Jacob stops by every Sunday, sometimes with Sarah, sometimes alone. Our conversations have deepened beyond the surface pleasantries that used to characterize family interactions. We talk about books, about current events, about his goals and dreams and the kind of man he wants to become. "You know what I've learned from watching you this year?" he said last week as we worked together in my garden, planting bulbs for next spring's flowers. "I've learned that integrity isn't inherited. It's chosen, every day, even when choosing it costs you something important." He's thinking about proposing to Sarah, he told me confidentially. They want to buy a small house, start their lives together with the kind of partnership I had with Robert, built on mutual respect and shared dreams rather than financial calculation. "I want what you and Grandpa had," he said. "The real thing. Not what my parents have. That transaction disguised as marriage. My watercolor painting has improved dramatically. The instructor, Helen, says I have a natural eye for color and composition. Last month, the community center displayed several of my pieces in their lobby exhibition, and I sold 2 paintings to strangers who saw beauty in something I'd created with my own hands. At 74, I'd discovered I was an artist. How many other talents, interests, and capabilities had I never explored because I was too busy being useful to other people? The house feels different now, too. Instead of the museum of other people's memories it had become, it's evolving into a reflection of who I am today. I've rearranged furniture to suit my preferences rather than maintaining the arrangements Robert and I established decades ago. I've painted the spare bedroom a soft lavender and turned it into an art studio where I can work on paintings when inspiration strikes. Most importantly, I've stopped seeing the house as a burden to be maintained or an asset to be protected. It's simply home, the place where I sleep safely, create freely, and live according to my own rhythms and desires. The neighbors who participated in David's character assassination campaign seem embarrassed when they encounter me now. Word of the court hearing and its outcome has spread through our small community, and the people who allowed themselves to be recruited as witnesses against my competency now understand they were manipulated. Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, apologized last month with obvious discomfort. "Margaret, I had no idea what David was really planning. He made it sound like he was worried about your safety." I accepted her apology graciously because harboring resentment would only poison my own peace of mind. But I also understood something important. People will believe what's convenient for them to believe, especially when it allows them to avoid uncomfortable moral decisions. The watercolor class has become the foundation of a new social circle. These women, Ruth, Carmen, Dorothy, and several others, have become genuine friends in a way I hadn't experienced since I was young. We meet for coffee, attend art exhibitions together, and share the kind of honest conversations that come from understanding that time is precious, and pretense is a luxury we can't afford. "You know what I love about being 70? Dorothy said recently as we compared paintings we'd completed that week. "I finally stopped caring what people think about my choices. I spent 50 years trying to be what everyone else needed me to be. Now I'm just being me. Being me. Such a simple concept, but so revolutionary after decades of defining myself through my relationships to other people, Robert's wife, David's mother, everyone's helper and supporter and self-sacrificing caretaker. Now I'm simply Margaret Jennings, painter, traveler, reader, gardener, friend. A woman with opinions and preferences and plans that belong entirely to herself. The legal aftermath of David's failed guardianship petition has been quietly resolved. The investigation into elder abuse found evidence of financial manipulation and emotional coercion, but David avoided criminal charges by agreeing to pay the legal fees I'd incurred defending myself. It wasn't justice, exactly, but it was acknowledgement that his actions had been wrong. More importantly, the whole experience has taught me to trust my own instincts about people and situations. The signs of David's betrayal had been there for years. The gradual decrease in genuine affection, the increasingly transactional nature of our interactions, the way he spoke about my life as if it were his property to manage. I'd ignored those signs because I desperately wanted to believe that love and sacrifice would eventually be rewarded with loyalty and care. I've learned that love given without boundaries, without reciprocity, without respect for your own needs, isn't actually love at all. It's a form of self-destruction that enables others to exploit your good intentions. The hardest lesson has been accepting that some relationships, even with people you love deeply, become toxic and must be ended for your own survival. Choosing yourself over family loyalty felt like betrayal at first, but I understand now that it was actually the first honest choice I'd made in years. As I sit here this morning planning my day, which might include painting, reading, calling one of my new friends, or simply sitting in my garden and enjoying the September sunshine, I feel something I haven't experienced since I was young, excited anticipation about my own future. At 74, I'm not winding down. I'm just getting started. Last week, Jacob brought me a brochure for art classes in Italy next summer. What do you think, Grandma? Want to learn to paint in Tuscany? 5 years ago, the idea would have seemed impossible, irresponsible, too expensive, too ambitious for someone my age. Now it seems like exactly the kind of adventure a woman who's finally learned to value her own dreams should pursue. Book it, I told him without hesitation, because I've discovered something that David never understood. Something that took me 74 years to fully comprehend. Your life doesn't end when you get old. It doesn't become less valuable, less worthy of investment and excitement and possibility. It just becomes more precious because you finally understand how finite and fragile and beautiful it really is. The woman who was terrified of losing her house, her independence, her dignity in a courtroom 6 months ago has been replaced by someone who knows that the most important things, self-respect, genuine relationships, the capacity for joy and growth, can't be stolen by legal documents or manipulative children. They can only be given away, and I'm never making that mistake again. If you've lived through something similar, if you've ever felt used, discarded, or devalued by people who were supposed to love you, let me ask you this. Have you ever found the courage to choose yourself over other people's convenience? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the first step toward finding our strength. And if this message resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. There are too many people out there who need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your life, your dignity, and your right to matter. Because you do matter. No matter what anyone else has told you. You matter.